It was supposed to be a simple issue, a misunderstanding, a dispute over a small thing, a violation of some obscure HOA rule. No big deal, right? That's what I thought too, until Karen, the HOA president, showed up at my door, her face contorted with the kind of self-righteous fury that only a person with too much power and too little self-awareness could possess. What started as a neighborly disagreement would quickly escalate into a fight for my home, and ultimately, a battle that would expose the dark side of the HOA and Karen's long history of extortion. The first encounter with Karen came out of nowhere. One morning, I opened my front door to find a letter on the doorstep, a crisp official-looking envelope marked with the HOA's insignia. It was a notice of violation. My crime? I had installed a small garden in my front yard, one that wasn't pre-approved by the HOA. The garden was nothing outrageous, just some flowers and a small vegetable patch, something I had done in an attempt to make my house feel more like home. But Karen didn't see it that way. According to her, it was an unsanctioned modification to the property, a violation of HOA regulations that could result in a fine or, worse, a demand to remove the garden entirely. It was petty. It was ridiculous. But Karen wasn't just being petty. She was playing a dangerous game, one that would soon involve far more than just a few plants in my yard. At first, I thought it was an isolated incident. I figured I'd go through the proper channels, request a review of the decision, and it would all be sorted out. But as I looked closer at the HOA documents, something struck me as odd. This wasn't the first time Karen had been involved in issuing excessive fines and penalties. I started speaking with my neighbors and realized that many of them had been subjected to the same kind of treatment: arbitrary fines, random inspections, and the constant threat of violations, all for trivial reasons. And when I dug a little deeper, I learned that Karen had been behind almost all of it. Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was using the HOA as a weapon, a tool to control people. I began to hear stories of people who had been forced out of their homes, those who had been pressured into selling at a loss, or who had been blackmailed into paying extortionate fees. Some were too afraid to speak out, too intimidated by Karen's position of power. But others were just waiting for the right person to come along and expose the truth. That person turned out to be me. I wasn't going to sit back and let Karen bully me, especially not when I started to realize that her behavior wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. This was part of a pattern, one that had been going on for years. People in the neighborhood had been complaining for ages about Karen's tactics, but no one had been brave enough to take her on. It wasn't until I started piecing together the larger picture that I saw just how deep the rot went. Karen had used her position to extort money from homeowners, demanding that they pay exorbitant fines for minor infractions, threatening them with lawsuits, and using the HOA's influence to pressure them into making certain donations to causes she controlled. It wasn't just about property values or community standards. It was about money, power, and control. I knew that if I was going to stand a chance of exposing her, I needed more than just a garden to argue about. I started investigating. I requested access to HOA records under the Freedom of Information Act, and what I found was shocking. There were dozens of documents detailing fines that had been levied without explanation, fees that seemed arbitrary, and payments that went directly into Karen's personal accounts. I began to see a pattern. Karen wasn't just running the HOA. She was using it as a personal business, a way to profit from the people she was supposed to be serving. I reached out to a few trusted neighbors, including Linda, who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Linda had seen it all: the shady deals, the threats, the manipulation. She was the first to tell me about the time Karen had forced a widow to sell her house after slapping her with an enormous fine for unsanctioned renovations that didn't even exist. Linda had also mentioned that Karen had gotten very cozy with some local developers who were looking to buy up properties on the cheap. I couldn't help but wonder if Karen was using her position to facilitate those sales, either taking a cut or pressuring people into selling when they didn't want to. It wasn't long before I discovered that Karen was far more involved in these shady deals than anyone could have guessed. As I dug into her financial records, I found transfers of money to real estate developers, kickbacks from contractors, and irregular payments from her personal accounts that could only be described as bribes. She had been using the HOA as a cover for an elaborate scheme to profit off the neighborhood, all while threatening homeowners with ridiculous fines and fees if they didn't comply with her demands. It was systematic, calculated, and devastating. But what really caught my attention was a file I found labeled the list. It was a list of homeowners, each with a corresponding amount of money they owed to the HOA, along with notes about their willingness to comply with Karen's demands. The list had been used as a way to keep track of people who could be pressured or blackmailed into paying up, and it made it clear that Karen had been running a racket, an extortion operation disguised as an HOA. I knew this was the smoking gun I had been looking for. Armed with this information, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in real estate law and corruption cases. Together, we built a case that would bring Karen's empire crashing down. We began gathering evidence, contacting other victims, and preparing for the legal battle of a lifetime. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the entire neighborhood, for everyone who had been exploited by Karen's corrupt reign. But Karen wasn't going to give up without a fight. As soon as she realized what I was doing, she pulled out all the stops. She hired a team of high-priced attorneys to intimidate me into backing down, sending me legal threats that claimed I was spreading false information and damaging her reputation. She tried to convince the other homeowners that I was the one causing trouble, trying to turn the community against me. But I wasn't afraid. The evidence was on my side. In the end, it came down to a public hearing. Karen's criminal activities had been exposed, and it was time for the community to make their voices heard. Everyone who had been victimized by Karen's tactics stood up and spoke out, sharing their stories, describing how they had been manipulated, blackmailed, and bullied. The floodgates opened, and Karen's power began to unravel. As I watched the proceedings, I felt a sense of justice wash over me. Karen's reign was finally over, and the truth had been exposed for all to see. As the hearing continued, Karen sat in the front row, her eyes darting nervously between her lawyers and the witnesses who were now presenting evidence against her. She had clearly underestimated the strength of the community and the determination of those she had tried to bully. For the first time, she looked out of control. Her once imposing demeanor was now replaced with a sense of desperation, as if the world she had carefully crafted was slipping away from her grasp. One by one, the victims came forward to testify. Each story was more shocking than the last, exposing a pattern of corruption, threats, and deceit. Neighbors spoke of the times they had been pressured to pay outrageous fines for minor infractions. Some told of how Karen had manipulated them into selling their homes for pennies on the dollar, threatening them with violations they couldn't afford to fight. Others described how Karen had used her position as HOA president to push developers to buy up properties in the neighborhood, using underhanded tactics to inflate property values and kick longtime residents out. I watched as Karen's legal team tried to discredit the witnesses, claiming they were exaggerating or outright lying. But the evidence spoke for itself. The documents, the financial records, the testimonies, it all painted a clear picture of a woman who had used her position of power to exploit everyone around her for personal gain. The more Karen's lawyers tried to cover up the truth, the more the walls around her began to crumble. As the day wore on, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The battle had been long and exhausting, but it was finally paying off. The truth was coming to light, and Karen was losing her grip on the community she had terrorized for so long. Every lie she had told, every person she had manipulated, was now being exposed for all to see. She had thought she could control the entire neighborhood, but now she was the one being controlled by the law. The judge, a stern woman who had been carefully listening to the testimonies, finally spoke. "This case is about more than just a few property violations," she said. "It's about the abuse of power, the exploitation of vulnerable people, and the corruption of an entire system. The evidence before me is clear, and I will not allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked." My heart raced as she turned to Karen. "You are hereby ordered to pay restitution to the victims of your actions, and you will face legal charges for the crimes committed under your watch. The full extent of your actions will be investigated, and you will be held accountable for the damage you've caused." Karen's face turned pale, her lips trembling as the weight of the verdict settled on her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she had nothing left to say. Her empire had crumbled, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. But even as Karen's reign came to an end, I knew that the fight was far from over. This wasn't just about taking down one corrupt HOA president. It was about cleaning up the mess she had left behind, the developers she had worked with, the city officials who had turned a blind eye to her actions. All of them needed to be held accountable. The community, once torn apart by Karen's manipulation, was beginning to come together. But there was still much to be done. In the weeks that followed, I worked with local authorities to ensure that the investigation continued. We dug deeper into the connections between Karen and the developers who had profited from her illegal land deals. As we uncovered more information, it became clear that Karen was just one cog in a much larger machine. Her network of corruption had extended far beyond the HOA, reaching into the very heart of the city's real estate market. The authorities began issuing subpoenas and conducting further investigations into the developers who had been involved in Karen's schemes. The more we uncovered, the more we realized how deep the corruption ran. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about an entire network of individuals who had used their power to manipulate the housing market and exploit vulnerable homeowners for their own gain. As the investigation progressed, more arrests were made. The developers who had worked with Karen were indicted, and several city officials who had been complicit in her actions were placed under investigation. The media coverage of the case intensified, and the public's outrage grew. People who had been victimized by Karen's schemes now had a voice, and they weren't going to let the system sweep the truth under the rug. But even as the legal process moved forward, Karen's actions still haunted me. The damage she had caused to my neighborhood, to my home, was something I couldn't easily forget. The fight wasn't just about holding her accountable. It was about rebuilding the trust that she had destroyed. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what we had endured. As the investigation gained momentum, I began working with a group of neighbors to form a community watch organization. We wanted to make sure that something like this could never happen again. We organized meetings, educated people about their rights, and created a support network for homeowners who had been taken advantage of by Karen and others like her. It was a way to rebuild what had been broken, to reclaim our neighborhood from the people who had tried to control it for their own benefit. But even as we took these steps toward rebuilding, Karen's influence still loomed large. She had caused so much damage that it would take time to truly heal. The community was scarred, but the sense of unity that had emerged in the wake of her downfall gave me hope. We were no longer just victims of her manipulation. We were a community coming together to fight back, to restore what had been taken from us. The more I worked alongside my neighbors to uncover the full extent of Karen's corruption, the more determined I became. This wasn't just about taking down Karen anymore. It was about ensuring that the system she had exploited could never be used to hurt anyone again. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every person who had been wronged by her, every family who had been forced to live under the shadow of her greed. As the investigation continued and the legal battles wore on, one thing became clear. The fight for justice was never over. Every step we took, every document we uncovered, and every person who came forward was one more piece of the puzzle that was slowly but surely bringing Karen's network to its knees. The road ahead would be long, but together, we would rebuild what Karen had tried to destroy. As the legal battle continued, the community that had once been divided under Karen's rule started to unite. People who had previously been afraid to speak out against her were now stepping forward, sharing their experiences and offering testimony. Neighbors who had been too intimidated to stand up were beginning to realize that they weren't alone. We had formed a united front, and Karen's influence was slowly but surely diminishing. The more people came forward with their stories, the stronger our case became. But just as it seemed like we were gaining traction, a new complication arose. Karen, desperate to protect herself, had managed to get a few of her old allies on her side, people who still held power in the neighborhood. A few developers who had worked with her before began to file motions to dismiss the evidence we had collected. They claimed it was insufficient, that the documents had been tampered with or were out of context. At first, it seemed like a simple legal tactic, but it was clear they were trying to derail the investigation. The pressure was mounting on both sides. Karen had already been publicly humiliated, but she wasn't going to let her empire fall without putting up a fight. She had her defenders, and they were doing everything they could to muddy the waters. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about the people who had benefited from her schemes, trying to preserve their wealth and power. I met with the authorities again, determined to push forward. We had to remain vigilant and steady in our pursuit of justice. The evidence against Karen and her collaborators was solid, but the legal system could be slow, and the people trying to protect Karen's network were powerful. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew we couldn't back down. I spent countless hours working with my attorney, gathering new documents, cross-referencing contracts, and interviewing witnesses. The more I dug, the more I uncovered about the depths of Karen's corruption. She wasn't just involved in real estate fraud. She was linked to several other schemes, from money laundering to bribery, all hidden behind the veil of the HOA. Every step I took seemed to reveal more of the ugly truth, and I knew there was no turning back. But the closer we got to exposing Karen's entire operation, the more desperate she became. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She started showing up at my house at all hours, demanding that I drop the case. She'd stand outside my door, knocking frantically and shouting threats through the windows. She tried to convince my neighbors to turn against me, telling them I was attacking the community, that I was destroying the very thing that made their neighborhood special. It was clear that Karen was using every tactic in the book to try to intimidate me, but I had come too far to back down now. One night, I received an unexpected visit. It was from one of the homeowners who had been targeted by Karen's schemes. She had come forward with evidence of her own, a series of emails that revealed how Karen had been pressuring people into selling their properties under market value. The emails were damning, but they also provided something even more crucial. They showed that Karen had been working with a well-known corrupt developer who had been bribing city officials to get favorable zoning deals. This developer was key to understanding the larger scope of Karen's illegal activities. As we reviewed the evidence together, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit. Karen wasn't just manipulating homeowners for financial gain. She was part of a larger network of real estate developers and shady investors who had been manipulating the entire housing market for years. What they had been doing wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. And I had the evidence to prove it. The more we uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just a fight for justice in my neighborhood. It was a battle that could have far-reaching consequences. If we could expose the full extent of Karen's network, it could reshape the way real estate transactions were conducted in the city. This wasn't just about Karen. It was about holding all the corrupt players accountable. This fight had turned into something bigger than I had ever anticipated. The next step was to take everything we had to the authorities. With the new evidence in hand, we had a stronger case than ever before. But I knew that Karen's allies were going to give up easily. They had already made it clear that they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. So, I began to prepare myself for the next round of legal battles, knowing that Karen and her associates would continue to fight tooth and nail to avoid facing the consequences of their actions. Despite the challenges ahead, I felt a sense of empowerment that I hadn't experienced before. Every new piece of evidence, every witness that came forward, brought us closer to the finish line. I had seen firsthand the impact of Karen's corruption on my neighbors, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. The fight was far from over, but with each step forward, I could feel the walls closing in on her. At the same time, I began receiving more calls and messages from people who had been victims of similar HOA abuses. They had seen what had happened to Karen, and they wanted to share their stories. It was clear that Karen was just one example of a much larger issue. People in positions of power who had been exploiting the very systems they were supposed to be upholding. The more stories I heard, the more determined I became to bring all of them to light. But there was still a long road ahead. Even though we were uncovering more and more evidence every day, the legal process was slow, and the forces working to protect Karen's empire were far from defeated. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the right path. I knew that Karen's days of manipulating the system were numbered, and every day brought us closer to making sure she would face justice for the harm she had caused. It wasn't just about exposing Karen anymore. It was about sending a message to the system, showing that no one was untouchable, no matter how powerful they thought they were. Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end, and with each step we took, it was clear that justice was finally within reach. As the case against Karen and her associates started to gather momentum, I felt the weight of everything that had been building for months finally coming to a head. The walls that Karen had carefully constructed around her operation were starting to crack, and I could almost see the end in sight. But with each new revelation, it became clear that the fight wasn't going to be over until the very last corrupt individual was held accountable. The deeper we dug, the more we uncovered, and the more dangerous the road ahead became. One evening, while reviewing some of the most recent evidence with my attorney, I received a phone call that stopped me in my tracks. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the message was urgent. "We know you're digging into Karen's dealings, and we need to warn you. She's not just targeting you anymore. She's made moves to come after your property. You need to be careful." My blood ran cold. The weight of what this meant was overwhelming. I'd been expecting retaliation from Karen, but this was different. She wasn't just trying to ruin my reputation or scare me into dropping the case. She was now trying to manipulate the very property I owned, using the power and influence she still had left. It was a reminder that this wasn't just about a community dispute anymore. It was a full-scale battle with much higher stakes. The person on the phone told me that Karen had reached out to a few of her remaining allies in the local government, quietly using her connections to file false claims about my property, attempting to create an issue that would force me into a legal battle over ownership. This was no longer just about a fence or an HOA violation. It was a calculated attempt to destroy everything I had worked for. I couldn't let this happen. I immediately contacted my attorney and relayed the information I had just received. He advised me to take immediate steps to protect my property. We filed additional legal documents to ensure that Karen's actions wouldn't interfere with my ownership, and he made arrangements to put a legal hold on any potential claims that might arise from her or her associates. It felt like we were playing defense now, and that wasn't where I wanted to be. I wanted to be on the offensive, uncovering more of Karen's corruption and ensuring she couldn't do any more damage. In the meantime, the authorities continued their investigation, but Karen's network was vast, and we couldn't be sure who was still working with her or who had turned against her. Every day felt like a race against time. Every new document I uncovered, every lead I followed, felt like it could be the one that finally brought everything to light. The pressure was mounting, but I knew I couldn't stop now. As the investigation deepened, Karen's behavior grew even more erratic. She tried to use her position as a former HOA president to rally some of the remaining homeowners to her cause, claiming that I was the one who was making trouble for the neighborhood. She even started a smear campaign, telling anyone who would listen that I was trying to destroy the sense of community she had worked so hard to create. The lies she was spreading seemed more desperate by the day. It was clear that Karen wasn't just worried about her legal fate. She was trying to salvage what little influence she still had. I knew I had to act fast. The case was moving forward, but with Karen's legal tactics becoming more aggressive, I realized I couldn't just wait for justice to unfold. I had to push harder, expose more of her underhanded dealings, and make sure that the authorities had everything they needed to bring down not just Karen, but the entire corrupt network she had built. The more I learned, the more I understood that Karen wasn't just a petty HOA president. She was the mastermind behind a corrupt empire that had destroyed lives and ruined people's futures for far too long. One afternoon, while going through more of the documents Sarah had given me, I found something that made my heart race. Hidden in a stack of receipts and contracts was a letter that hadn't been seen before. It was a correspondence between Karen and one of the real estate developers who had worked with her to facilitate the illegal land deals. The letter contained instructions on how to smooth over a shady transaction involving land that had been purchased using fraudulent means. Not only was this a direct link to her illegal activities, but it also showed that Karen had been well aware of the extent of the fraud she was involved in. This letter was the final piece of the puzzle. I immediately shared this with my attorney and the authorities. With this new piece of evidence, we could finally bring everything into the light. The developers who had been working with Karen, the city officials who had been complicit, and the vast network of people she had used to keep her empire running. They would all face the consequences. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen had already shown that she was willing to do anything to protect herself, and her fight was far from over. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me, but I refused to back down. The closer we got to bringing Karen to justice, the more she fought back. She began trying to discredit the evidence we had, claiming that it was all fabricated or misinterpreted. She threatened legal action against anyone who spoke out against her, but it was too late. The walls were closing in, and the truth was coming out. At the same time, I continued working with my neighbors, helping them come forward with their own stories of how Karen had manipulated them. The more voices we had, the more powerful our case became. It wasn't just about one person fighting back anymore. It was a movement. The community had come together to reclaim their neighborhood, to take back what had been stolen from them by Karen's greed and manipulation. The legal battles were intensifying, but I felt a sense of hope. We had the evidence, we had the support of the community, and we had the will to fight for what was right. I wasn't alone in this anymore. The community was behind me, and together, we were going to expose Karen for the fraud she was and put an end to her reign of terror once and for all. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Karen was running out of time. The authorities were closing in on the remaining members of her network, and the walls she had carefully built around her were starting to fall apart. The fight wasn't over, but the finish line was in sight. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that Karen had been playing a much bigger game than I ever anticipated. Her connections ran deep, way beyond just the local HOA and the few developers I had initially suspected. She had been a key player in a larger scheme, one that involved land manipulation, money laundering, and corrupt dealings that reached the very core of the city's planning department. My attorney and I worked tirelessly to connect the dots. We spent late nights going through the documents, cross-checking timelines, and reaching out to potential witnesses. Each new lead we followed seemed to open up a new avenue of investigation. I couldn't help but feel both exhilarated and overwhelmed by how much Karen had orchestrated behind the scenes. She wasn't just an HOA president with a grudge. She was a criminal mastermind who had used the power of the HOA to push her personal agenda and line her pockets. The more I found, the more I realized how much Karen had manipulated the system. She'd used her position to approve zoning changes, to manipulate property values, and to demand kickbacks from developers. All along, she'd been hiding her illegal activities behind the facade of community improvement and neighborhood rules. The HOA, once meant to protect the homeowners, had been weaponized as a tool for Karen's own gain. I felt sick to my stomach, but I knew we couldn't stop. Not now. Not when we were so close to bringing her down. One afternoon, I received a call from Linda, one of the neighbors who had been personally victimized by Karen's practices. Linda was the first person who had spoken up about Karen's unfair practices, and now she was offering more crucial information. "I found something," she said, her voice shaking. "It's a list of homeowners who've been blackmailed. Some of them are people who sold their properties under duress or because Karen threatened them with absurd fines. I've got the list, and some of the names on it are people I didn't expect." My heart skipped a beat. I could feel the gravity of what this could mean. If this list held the names of people who had been forced into selling their properties under pressure, it could be the nail in the coffin for Karen's entire operation. This wasn't just about the fine I had been slapped with for my garden. It was about homes being stolen from people who had no choice but to comply with Karen's threats. I asked Linda to send the list over immediately. As soon as I had it in my hands, I knew we had something significant. This wasn't just a matter of overzealous fines or petty HOA violations anymore. This was a systematic effort to force people out of their homes, to push them into selling at below market prices, all to make a profit for Karen and her developers. I could feel the weight of everything I had uncovered settle in on my shoulders. But I wasn't backing down. I had to finish what I had started. The stakes were higher now, and it wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about stopping Karen from destroying more lives. With the new evidence in hand, I took the list to the authorities. They were quick to act, contacting the homeowners who had been blackmailed and starting investigations into the sales of properties. It was clear that Karen's scheme had been larger than anyone could have imagined. She wasn't just collecting fines. She was creating an illegal real estate empire, one that had left many families without homes. And now, with this list of coerced sales, we could trace the money and follow the connections that had kept Karen's operation running for so long. But even as the authorities moved forward with the investigation, Karen's grip on the HOA remained strong. Her supporters, though dwindling, were still trying to protect her, filing motions to delay the court proceedings and challenging the evidence we had gathered. They fought tooth and nail to keep the status quo, but it was becoming clearer with every passing day that Karen's time was running out. She tried to rally the few remaining homeowners who still supported her, painting herself as a victim of a smear campaign. She claimed that I was just out to destroy everything she had worked for, and that the community would fall apart without her leadership. But the truth was too strong. The evidence, the testimonies, and the documents we had gathered over the months were irrefutable. The more Karen tried to defend herself, the more she exposed the depth of her corruption. One day, as I was heading home after another long meeting with my attorney, I received an unexpected call. It was from the police. "We've made a breakthrough," the officer said. "We've traced Karen's connections to several of the developers she was working with. We also found evidence of wire transfers to offshore accounts. This goes beyond land deals. Karen's been laundering money for years." I felt a rush of adrenaline. The investigation had just gone from a local issue to something much bigger. Money laundering, illegal real estate deals, bribery. Karen's criminal activities were connected to a global network of corruption. The more we uncovered, the more we realized how many people had been involved. Karen had been working with international developers, siphoning money through shell companies, and using her position in the HOA as a cover for everything. The scale of what she had done was staggering, but it was also a turning point. With this new evidence, we had everything we needed to bring Karen's entire operation down. The authorities were now working on international collaboration, reaching out to law enforcement agencies overseas to trace the money and follow the trail of corruption. We were no longer just fighting to hold Karen accountable for her actions. We were working to dismantle an entire network of corruption that had been built on the backs of innocent homeowners. But as we prepared to move forward with the final push to expose Karen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. I knew she would pull every trick in the book to escape the consequences of her actions. But I was ready for whatever she threw at me. I had come too far, and I wasn't about to stop now. As the case against Karen moved into its final stages, the intensity of the situation was becoming overwhelming. We were no longer just battling her for control of the neighborhood. This had grown into a full-scale legal war. Karen had been working her entire life to amass power and wealth, and now, with everything falling apart, she was grasping at whatever she could to keep herself from being held accountable. Every move she made felt like a desperate attempt to stay in control, but she was running out of options. I could see it in her eyes when she appeared in court. She wasn't the confident, domineering figure she once was. The once persistent look of superiority had been replaced by something darker, fear. Fear that her carefully constructed world was coming apart, that all her years of manipulation, extortion, and corruption were now exposed for everyone to see. But despite that fear, I knew she still had one final trick up her sleeve. Her entire network of criminals was starting to fall, but she still had a few loyal followers who could help her stage a comeback. The investigation had revealed so much more than I could have ever anticipated. Documents, wire transfers, secret accounts, and key players. Each piece of evidence painted a more horrifying picture of how deep Karen's involvement in illegal activities truly went. But as the authorities closed in on the remaining players in her operation, they also made an unsettling discovery. Karen had been hiding a significant amount of her ill-gotten gains in overseas accounts that were nearly impossible to trace. That revelation was a game-changer. The authorities now had to work through international channels, relying on financial investigators, government agencies, and legal experts from around the world to track down the assets Karen had stashed away. It wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was a necessary step if we were going to make sure Karen couldn't escape justice. In the meantime, I focused on supporting the other victims of Karen's schemes, the people who had been forced to sell their homes, the families who had been blackmailed, the individuals who had lived under Karen's oppressive rule for far too long. Many of them were struggling to rebuild their lives after Karen had destroyed everything they had worked for. I reached out to local organizations, offering them a platform to share their stories and connect with others who had been victimized. It was important for us to show the world the full extent of what had happened and make sure Karen's crimes didn't just fade into the background once the trial was over. But even as we prepared to take down the rest of Karen's criminal network, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Karen hadn't given up yet. She still had connections, still had resources, and I knew she wouldn't hesitate to use them to escape the consequences. Her attorneys were still pushing for delays, making last-ditch efforts to appeal the evidence we had gathered. I wasn't sure if the case would ever be truly over until Karen was behind bars, and even then, I feared the chaos she had caused might linger for a long time. The day I received a call that would change everything, I was sitting at home, trying to relax after weeks of tense negotiations. The authorities had just made another significant breakthrough, and I hoped this was the final piece of the puzzle. But when I answered the phone, the voice on the other end was one I wasn't expecting. "It's time," the officer said. "We've traced the last of the missing assets to a private estate in another country. Karen's network is crumbling faster than we anticipated. It's now or never. We're going in." The authorities had managed to track down the last of Karen's hidden wealth, and they were preparing to seize it before she could move the funds again. This was it, the final blow to her criminal operation. It was a moment of triumph, but also one of nervous anticipation. This was the moment I had been waiting for, when Karen's empire would finally come crashing down, and she would be forced to face the consequences of her actions. I could hardly sleep that night. The news that Karen's assets had been located and that the authorities were about to move in filled me with a sense of justice and finality, but also anxiety. The wheels were turning, and there was no going back now. I knew Karen wouldn't go down easily. She had been playing the game for far too long. But the thought that this nightmare could finally end, that the truth would be heard, was almost enough to keep me calm. The next day, I received word that the authorities had successfully seized Karen's assets from overseas. With that, the case entered its final phase. Karen's financial empire was gone, and her connections were being severed one by one. But despite everything, Karen's legal team was still fighting, trying to wrangle some sort of plea deal or reduced sentence. They were using every trick in the book, but it was too late. The evidence against her was irrefutable, and the weight of her crimes was too heavy for her to escape. As the weeks passed, the pressure continued to mount. The authorities were finalizing their case, preparing to bring Karen to trial on charges of money laundering, corruption, fraud, and blackmail. But the longer this dragged on, the more I realized just how deep Karen's web of lies had gone. There were still people out there who had been complicit in her crimes, and I knew that once Karen went down, the ripple effect would expose even more corruption that had been hidden for years. But for now, we had made significant progress. Karen's reign of terror was finally nearing its end. She had been exposed for what she truly was, an opportunistic criminal who had manipulated a system that was meant to serve the community. She had used her position to exploit people for her own gain, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The court case was almost complete, and I was more determined than ever to see it through to the end. The day of the trial finally arrived, and I felt a sense of both relief and anticipation. It had been a long, grueling process, but we were on the verge of justice. Karen's defense team was still throwing everything they could at us, but the evidence we had gathered over the months was overwhelming. She had tried every trick in the book, delaying tactics, false accusations, and even using her remaining allies to discredit the witnesses. But now, it was all coming down to this. I arrived at the courthouse early, feeling the weight of the case settle over me. I could see the tension in the air. Karen was sitting with her lawyers, but this time, there was no cocky smile on her face. She looked defeated, though she would never admit it. Her usual air of superiority had all but vanished, replaced with a thin veneer of confidence that seemed to crumble the moment the trial began. The prosecutor laid out the case with precision, showing the jury just how extensive Karen's web of corruption had been. The documents, the money trails, the testimonies, they all told the same story. Karen had used her position to extort money from homeowners, pressured them into selling their properties under false pretenses, and used her influence to manipulate the real estate market. The amount of damage she had caused was staggering, and it was clear that she had no intention of stopping. But now, there was nowhere left for her to hide. The prosecution called the key witnesses, homeowners who had been blackmailed, families who had been forced out of their homes, and former developers who had worked with Karen to inflate property values and sell land illegally. Their testimonies were powerful, each one painting a clearer picture of Karen's manipulation and greed. The defense team tried to poke holes in the witnesses' stories, but it was obvious that they were clutching at straws. Karen's carefully constructed lies were finally being torn apart. As the trial continued, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice starting to take hold. The more I watched the proceedings unfold, the more I realized that this wasn't just about taking down Karen. It was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could use their power to exploit others without consequence. The truth had finally come to light, and Karen's reign of terror was nearing its end. In the closing arguments, the prosecutors summarized everything perfectly. This case is about accountability. Karen used her position to manipulate, blackmail, and deceive those around her for her own gain. She used her authority to create a network of corruption, and now we have the opportunity to ensure that she is held responsible for her actions. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, but in the end, the verdict was clear. Karen was found guilty on all charges: fraud, money laundering, blackmail, and conspiracy. The weight of the decision was almost surreal. For so long, it had felt like I was fighting a losing battle, but now I could finally see that justice was being served. As the judge sentenced Karen, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of emotions. There were tears from those who had been victims of her schemes, cheers from those who had fought for the truth, and a sense of closure that settled over the room. Karen would face time in prison, and the damage she had caused would finally be undone. But even as the case was wrapping up, I couldn't help but think about the aftermath. The road to justice had been long, but it had been worth it. The community had fought together, and in the end, the truth had triumphed. But it wasn't just about Karen anymore. The fight had sparked something bigger, a movement to hold those in power accountable, to ensure that no one could manipulate the system without facing the consequences. With the trial finally over, the next steps would be about rebuilding the neighborhood and ensuring that nothing like this ever happened again. The HOA would be reformed, and new safeguards would be put in place to prevent future abuses. People were starting to come together, and while it would take time to heal, there was now a sense of unity and strength that had never been there before. Karen may have lost the battle, but her actions had left scars that would take years to mend. However, the victory was sweet, not just for me, but for every homeowner who had been wronged by her. The message had been sent loud and clear. Abuse of power would not be tolerated. The community began to rebuild, stronger than ever, and I couldn't help but feel proud of what we had accomplished. It had been a long, hard road, but justice had finally been served. Karen's empire had fallen, and the people she had exploited were now free to move on with their lives. If you've enjoyed this journey of exposing corruption and standing up for justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to stay updated on more stories like this one. Thanks for being a part of this journey with me. Together, we can make a difference.